Okay, so it's just setting us up here to go live. Be live in just a second here. Hello, everyone. If you're tuning in from the start, we'll just get started in just a moment, waiting for a few more folks to log in. If you are joining us, feel free to say hi, where you're from, your name. If you're a member of American Ancestors in the Facebook comment section, we love to hear from you at the start of the program. And we will get started in just a second. Great, so I see a few people joining us. Feel free to say hi in the comment section. We'd love to hear where you're from. And if you're a member of American Ancestors, thank you for joining us. Okay, welcome everyone to our most recent installment of Facebook Live. My name is Trisha Labby, Events Manager here at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'll be moderating today's event. For anyone joining us for the first time, American Ancestors and NEHGS is a nonprofit organization. We're supported by our members and donors. We provide resources in nearly all aspects of family history, and we're really pleased to offer such programming as today's presentation for our friends around the world. In today's presentation, we'll be venturing into the world of our conservator, Todd Pattison. Todd will show us a selection of items from our special collections that he's been working on fixing up and preserving for us. Todd Pattison, as I mentioned, is conservator here at American Ancestors NEHGS. So Todd works to preserve and care for our collections of books, manuscripts, and fine art. Todd comes to American Ancestors with more than 25 years of experience from the Northeast Document Conservation Center and has also worked as collections conservator at the Harvard College Library. He has an undergraduate degree in art history from Nazareth College and a Master of Library Science from the University of Alabama. He's also a fellow of the American Institute for Conservation. Along with all of that, Todd also regularly presents webinars, courses, and conferences for us at the Brew Family Learning Center here at American Ancestors. After Todd's presentation, we will have time for questions from all of you in the audience. So throughout the presentation, if you think of any questions or comments, please put them in that comment section on Facebook, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. Before I pass it over to Todd, another quick reminder that this presentation will be recorded and can be found on our Facebook page and on our YouTube page after the broadcast. So if you're unable to attend the whole presentation live, or if anyone out there experiences any technical difficulties, don't worry, you won't miss any of the content. You can always watch that recording later on your own time. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Todd to get started.
Thank you, Tricia, and thank you for joining us today. You may notice that I'm not in a conservation lab. I'm actually in an office. Due to COVID protocols, it's better that I do this from our office. So I want you to at least see the conservation lab or part of the conservation lab that I normally am working in, so that you get a sense of where this work takes place. So this is part of the conservation lab. You notice there are benches to work at, there are drawers to store flat paper and other materials. There's a couple of book presses in this photo, and those are actually late 19th century pieces of equipment. Some of the equipment that we use is quite old because it's what they would have used at the time some of the books were produced, and it also still functions really well. What you don't see in this slide are things like a wall-mounted cutter that we use to cut large boards down, board shear. We have a large sink that we use when we have to do aqueous treatments. But this will at least give you a better sense of the conservation space that I'm normally working in. So having said that, I think I'd like to start to show you the first object that I'm going to talk about today. And so this is an 18th century vellum bound manuscript. And so the vellum binding refers to the covering material. It's an animal skin that's prepared differently from an animal skin that's turned into leather. So this is a harder, smoother material. It's stretch dried, and it's also has been historically used as a writing material and a covering material. So before we start any treatments on an object like this, and this object is from our special collections department, we do documentation, both written documentation and photographic documentation. So in this next image, you will get a sense of what that documentation entails, at least photographically. So we have some notes down at the bottom of what the object is. This is MSS, which stands for Manuscript 1180, the Gore roll of arms, and it gives kind of a probable date of the person who created the object. And then below that, this is before treatment and the date when we started the treatment of it. And this documentation helps us to keep track of what we do to an object. We can list the materials and the techniques that we use. And it will also let any future researcher or curator or conservator who might interact with this object know how it changed with the conservation treatment that we performed on it. So we're going to take a look a little later in the upper right-hand corner of this. So just kind of keep this image in mind. In the next image, you'll be able to see the interior part of the binding with the text block removed. Now, the specific type of binding, the binding structure, is a laced case binding. So it's not a pure case binding like you would find in the 19th and 20th century, what a typical hardback book that you would buy today has. The binding is constructed off of the text block, and then the sewing slips or the sewing supports of the text block, which in this case were parchment, would be then laced through that binding. And you can see that there are a couple of kind of slits along the spine where they would get laced through, and that attaches the binding to the text block. So it was fairly easy to remove the binding from the text block in this instance. And on the right of this image, you're seeing some of the sewing supports and the threads that were taken out of the text block in order for us to work on. And those will all be saved so they can be studied by someone in the future. Now, this next image is a detail of that upper right-hand corner that we saw in the documentation slide. And on the left, you're seeing what this was like before we treated it. And on the right, you're seeing the after treatment. So a conservator not only sometimes adds things to material to try to strengthen it or prolong its life or make it usable, but they also can take things away from an object. So this was treated decades ago, somewhat heavy-handed by putting these fairly opaque pieces of paper all along the edges. And so those were removed in situ, kind of aqueously with a poultice to try to strip it back so that on the right, you're seeing more of the original object and less of the repair that was done. And so what we're trying to do is to show as much of the original object in as safe a way as possible without putting a lot of, our 21st century into it, so that you're seeing the object as opposed to seeing the repairs. So I want to show you now parts of the book. It's in treatment now. Here's the binding. And you can see some of these holes here where it was originally laced through. You can see the light through that. And I wanted to show you this because the paste downs were actually removed from this in order to try to make the binding flat again. So right now you see the binding is fairly flat. Over time, this binding had cupped quite a bit because this outside parchment tends to pull a lot more than the paper on the inside. And so as this pulled, it kind of created this almost a potato chip shape where it just kept distorting it. And so by lining it with some new handmade paper on the inside, we can get it flat again so that it's going to create a better object for the text block. So this is the front paste down, which was removed and will be put back during the completion of the treatment. You can see that some repairs were done on the back of this object. Because that's going to go against the board, you won't see any of those repairs when it's done. Now the signatures or sections of the book have all been repaired. And so it's now ready to be resewn. So you can see the spine folds of all of those signatures now are, they're stable, they're sound, we can sew through them and they'll be able to withstand that sewing and use. And so here's another page of this object, just so you get a better sense of what the object is. This was done probably right after the mid 18th century. It's American. It's showing coats of arms. They're all manuscript. So this was done by a particular individual, Gore. And he painted them as well as drew them and kept notes on who the families were. So it's really an important object, an important American object. And so we wanted to do the conservation treatment both to image the object in the best possible state to get the best capture and to make sure that it was stable for researchers to use it in the future. Now the sections of the book are made by a bunch of pieces of paper folded together, and the back sections of the book are blank. The creator of this object wasn't able to completely use every page, and so we can show you what some of these pages look like. This is the actual back page of the book, which has more, a little bit more damage from handling over time. And each one of these folded pages is from a handmade sheet of paper that was about this size. So there's watermarks in here. You can probably see the chain lines in here if I hold it up a little bit. So they just took the sheets of paper as they were made and folded them once, and that became the book. So at this point, we'll take all of these signatures, we'll sew them onto parchment slips or sewing supports. And then at the end, those sewing supports will get laced back through the binding to connect the binding to the supports and the text block, and then paste downs will go back down, and then a box will get constructed to try to better protect the object in storage moving forward. So it's a very exciting project, and I wanted you to be able to see one of the projects that we're working on kind of in mid-treatment. So I also wanted to show you another object. I have the object here. It's finished its treatment. So in order to show you a little bit more about it, I think we'll go back to see a couple of images from during the treatment of this object. In this first image are actually two of the pages from it. So this is a book called Flowers of the Holy Land, and it's flowers of Israel, Jerusalem. And each one of these flowers, and you're seeing two of them, or the decorations on the pages are made up from dried flowers and dried leaves, other botanicals that are actually adhered to a page. So in order to better protect it, they adhered them to a fairly stiff page. It's almost like a board. There's no flex in it, because if this started to flex at all, then it would crack those botanical specimens and could eventually lead to them falling off. So you notice at the top, there's the Hebrew language describing what's on the page. And then at the bottom, It's also in English, German, and French. And this would have been a tourist object, so someone who was making a grand tour to the Holy Land could buy this and take it home. And it would have also been for sale in other countries, including America, for someone who had an interest who wasn't actually able to travel to Jerusalem to purchase this. So these are stiff pages, and you'll notice at the top, you can see a white cloth strip along the top of both of these. So in the next image, you'll see the way that they put this book together. So they took two of these stiff pages and connected them with a cloth hinge. And that cloth hinge allowed it to be sewn through that common fold so that the book could be turned into a text block from all of these single leaves. And so by the way they stand up this way, I placed them like this so you get the sense of how stiff those boards are, but also how if you sewed through every one of those folds at the top and then connected it with a sewing support, it would hold everything together. So in the next image, I wanted to show you the back cover. The back cover and the front and back covers of this book are made out of cypress wood. Olive wood. I don't know why I said cypress wood. Olive wood, which is, makes a lot of sense, being from Israel. And the back cover had split and there were losses. And in consultation with the curator, we decided to put the cover back together and put it back on the object, but we didn't want to fill those losses and try to make it look like new wood in that place. So we just had a board, very thin cardstock board on the interior part of the board where it would get covered by the paste down of the book, just so that there was something there, but we didn't want to try to fill that wood in. And so now we can go back live and I'll show you the book itself. So this is the volume. Now, obviously, because it's in Hebrew, it opens from, what we might consider in a Western tradition, Western European tradition, to be the back of the book. And so that's where the title is. So what we were looking at before, the split cover, is actually on the recto of the book, or the front of the book if this had been an English book. Now, the original leather spine from this object was missing, but we had some remnants inside the board so that we knew it was a kind of a dark gray leather spine. So we replaced that spine. And when we sewed all of the pages back together, one of the things that we were very concerned with is that it would open well, because obviously we would probably want to display this book at some point. Researchers would want to use it. And so we wanted to open very nicely. And here you see another one of the decorations on the page. This one uses some wood to create a kind of chalice or something that the flowers are floating in. So what we need to keep in mind with these bound volumes is that they move, they flex, people are going to use them. So we need to think about that movement of the book and how that's all going to work as someone is using it. So here is the Hebrew title page on this book. So, a very interesting object. The two objects that I've shown you so far are really quite interesting. One is from our special collections, the Gore roll. This particular object, the Flowers of the Holy Land, is from our Jewish Heritage Center, who has their own collections. We also have a general collection, a non-circulating collection of slightly more than 100,000 volumes. And so we do work on those materials in our conservation lab as well. So the next image, we can show you kind of a typical book that comes to the conservation lab from our general collections. So this is the genealogical record of the descendants of Thomas Mills. It was printed in 1893. And if you look at the left-hand side of the title page, you can see where it's broken off of its what's now a stub that's connected with the binding. And several pages beneath that have also broken in the same way. Unfortunately, the paper that was used on this book was not of a very high quality. And over the last 120, 130 years, that paper has broken down even further to the point where it's really compromised the book itself. And we have a lot of 19th century and early 20th century very thin volumes of family records. Someone would produce their family records. They would produce, so many, usually a small amount, 100, 200, 500, and these would get dispersed. And now not many institutions hold them, so we're one of the few that does. So I wanted to show you a little bit about the bindings that these were typically put in. So if we can go back to live again. This is a kind of a typical binding that we put these books in, 100 years ago, 120 years ago, because they were going to be in a library. We wanted to have a robust binding. You can see the call numbers on it. There's a thing that this is not to be taken from the library, so it was non-circulating. This was a very thin volume, only about 8 pages, and so in order to make an actual book, they put all these blank pages in the back, and they tended to oversew these books, meaning that they took thread and they went over the spine edges, which then restricts the opening and causes that breaking that we saw in the other volume that we looked at. So this was the book that was in this binding that I just showed you. It's only 8 pages, or excuse me, 12 pages. They all have a common fold here. So if we sew through that fold, they would all stay together. That's probably how they were bound originally. Might have had a paper cover, or it could have just been this simple title page and then some sewing on the edge. So it's really kind of more the binding that's doing damage, but also the binding was preserving it for the last 140 years so that we would still have it. What we do with a lot of these pamphlets is we put them in a pamphlet binder, and we use a clear fronted pamphlet binder so that someone who's browsing the shelves looking for this will be able to see the title page and know what it is. This has a cloth hinge in it that allows us to sew through the cloth hinge with the pamphlet in place, and that will hold it in place. And then the cloth hinge just goes up on the other board, and then it works like a book. Now, I have another one that I can show you, a completed one. So here's the pamphlet. This has its original pink paper cover in it. And so you can see when you open the cover, it operates just like a book. It opens extremely well because it's just sewn through this. So I could even fold it back kind of more than 180 degrees because it's just a flat sheet of paper, a bunch of flat sheets of paper. And then in order to take this out, we can simply cut the sewing thread at the back and easily remove it. Unlike this previous binding that was used 100 years ago, where there's a lot more adhesive involved and other things that would really make it more difficult to take apart. Now, in some ways, our books are very much, they have a history of themselves. They have almost their own genealogy, and we try to maintain all of those records as well. So this was the original owner of this volume, and this was their book plate that was in it. This is the book plate that we put in it. When we accessioned it to the library, we noted at the bottom that it was a gift of Seymour Morris. And so we want to keep this record with this book kind of as its own genealogy, the genealogy of this particular book. We also put a call number on it so that it can be shelved and people can find it. So, that's some of the workflow from the general collections that we have, again, non-circulating. And I wanted to show you an object kind of before treatment. This is Boston and its vicinity. This is a map of 1886. And one of the reasons that I wanted to show you this is because we have decisions that we have to make when we do conservation. And we have curators, there's a curator of the JHC collection, there are curators in special collections, there are librarians for the general collections, and they help the conservation staff make decisions about what to do, especially with an object like this, where it's a folded map inside this case. So it looks like a book, but it's a folded map. And I think we have an image that shows you about roughly half of this folded map. So you'll get to see it a little bit better. So it's a map of Boston and its vicinities in 1886. Now, this is important for people doing research here at American Ancestors because Boston has changed over time. You'll notice there's no Logan Airport. There's no area where Logan Airport is. A place like Scully Square, which would be on this map, is now where Government Center is. If you know Boston at all, it's a whole kind of brutalist architecture complex. And so a lot of these streets that people's ancestors lived on in the 19th century, you can no longer find in reality. So you have to go back to these types of maps. Now, the problem with a map that folds back up and then unfolds when you want to look at it, and then you fold it back up, is these folds tend to get damaged over time with the opening and closing of it. And you can see the kind of broad stripes of paper that you have on this map are repairs that were done to try to strengthen some of those folds. So if we go back to the live shot, I can hold up again part of this map and show you how cumbersome it is to use it, especially as it ages, because this is almost 140 years old now. So as a researcher tries to use it, it's very difficult to use. Now, if we were, let's say, a transportation museum, then we might consider keeping it in this folded format to show how people were using transportation, maps, things like that, and how people were purchasing those, what they looked like. Here, there's part of the map still attached to the cover because one of these quadrants gets pasted down to the cover, and that's how it stays into the case. For us, since we have researchers that are really looking for the information on the map itself, it's better for us to take this map, to make it flat, to do the repairs that are necessary, to house it with the cover that it came with, but to make sure that it stays flat so that people can easily use it. And again, that's one of the directions that you could go in with a conservation treatment of this. We just have to decide what's the best direction for the researchers and the members of American Ancestors. So I just wanted to have you get a sense of how we have to make decisions about things. And there's not only one right way to do conservation. There are many different ways. Now we have other collection areas. We have rare books is a separate collection area. There's about 12,000 rare books housed here on Newbury Street, and the Conservation Lab does conservation work for that. And we also have a fine art collection, prints, drawings on paper, paintings, textile pieces, and the Conservation Lab works on some of that material. If it's art on paper, we'll work on that. We don't have the expertise in-house to do paintings. We don't have the expertise in-house to do textiles, so we contract with outside providers for that. But I wanted to show you one object from our fine art collection. And it's a little bit maybe unexpected for you. This is a newspaper. It's called The Young American. It's from April 12th, 1865, which obviously was quite a monumental month in the history of America. Abe Lincoln would be shot and killed a few days after this newspaper was produced. And the reason that we have this newspaper is because of the publisher of it. At the time, a 14-year-old Cyrus H.K. Curtis, who went on to become probably the most famous publisher of newspapers and magazines in America. At the time of his death, he was estimated to be worth a little over $43 billion. That's figuring it in today's money. He didn't quite have that much money. He printed this newspaper in Portland. His family eventually moved to Boston, and then he moved to Philadelphia, where he made his publishing empire, which included the Ladies' Home Journal and the Saturday Evening Post. So we have this particular newspaper because we have a beautiful oil portrait of Cyrus Curtis, and we have a lot of papers from the Curtis family that have been donated to us. And I wanted to show you a few. This has obviously been treated and it's been framed, so I wanted to show you a few images of this in conservation, in treatment, so that you'll have a better understanding what we did to it. So it came to us in a mat. It was actually a double window mat. So this is the front. And then there was a corresponding mat on the back, because as a newspaper, it would have printing on the back. And so they wanted that to be seen, and that's why they matted it this way. You can see the mat is acidic, it's damaged. The paper, the newspapers had some issues because it was exposed to light. And so we wanted to take it out of this mat in order to treat it, because we couldn't really treat it within the mat, and we didn't want to display it in this mat. So the next image shows you the same view with the front window opening removed. And you can probably get a good sense in this image that window mat was glued to the newspaper edges and to the back window mat, the reverse window mat, so you can see the back of it. So this also meant that the newspaper was glued to the other mat as well. So we had to mechanically remove those mats and then use local applications of moisture to remove any kind of residual adhesive and mats themselves. We then washed this newspaper to try to wash some of the degradation out of it. And then we wanted to mat it and reframe it ourselves. So if we go to the next image, you'll see the newspaper after treatment. And this is a really great illustration of light damage. You know, what light can do to an object if it's exposed to light for a very long time. So you can see the outer part of this newspaper is very white compared to the part that was actually exposed by the mat. And so it's simply the light damaging that paper and darkening it, and also decreasing the structural integrity of it. So it fortunately still had enough structural integrity that we were able to consider framing. And instead of adhering it to a mat all the way around the way it was originally, you can see at the top the two little white areas that go up from the newspaper. Those are Japanese paper hinges, so that we can then hinge this newspaper into the mat, so that in order to take it out again, you can simply lift the mat up and remove those hinges. So this gives you a little bit a better view after treatment before it gets framed. So we put it into a frame to be part of an exhibit that we have at here at American Ancestors on the Cyrus Curtis publishing empire, because we have not only his portrait, but we have some of the other publications that they put out, including a couple that I mentioned and several others. They were still publishing works, obviously long after Cyrus Curtis's death in the 70s and 80s. And along with that, we tied in like Godey's Ladies magazine, some of the publications from the mid-19th century that kind of preceded the work that Cyrus Curtis was doing. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview of what we're doing in the Conservation Lab here at American Ancestors. And I think we have some time. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Great. Thank you so much, Todd. You really took us through a great look at a show and tell of our special collections, chose some great objects to highlight both, pre, post, and during your conservation work. That was great to see. And it's so important to, keep these objects preserved, like you said, hopefully so that researchers who come to our facility or contact us online can still use those and enjoy them in whatever way they're meant to be enjoyed. We did have a couple questions out there in the comment section. A reminder to folks that you can still put any questions or comments there, and I'll feed them to Todd as we go. First, you talked a little bit about your decision-making process, object to object in preserving each object that you talked about. But Nanette was wondering how you decide which volumes or items get preserved or conservation work. She imagines that many also get digitized, especially some printed volumes that are used a lot. But could you talk a little bit more about your process there?
Sure. So, I'm probably not the decision maker for the most part. I kind of let the curators and the librarians know what's possible, but ultimately they're the ones that would choose a particular direction for the conservation. Now, the way that they determine that is oftentimes through use, especially for our general collections, our rare book collections, or items that are going to get digitized, because we know that those are important to people right now. So the pamphlets and things like that, if someone uses that pamphlet and we notice that there's an issue with it, then that will trigger conservation review and we'll decide what to do. Now we're trying to digitize, much of the material that we have because we know we can make it more available to a wider audience by doing that. So the Gore roll we wanted to do because it is an important object. It did have some issues. It was really breaking down and we were concerned with people using it. And it's something that people have a lot of interest in because it's 18th century American. And we also wanted to image it. We wanted to, and we will be soon putting up high quality digital images of every page in that object. And so the best time to image it is during conservation because we can do it when the object is, put apart. If you can imagine the way this object is now, given that the pages are all, kind of individual, that it can easily be handled. We can get a very good capture on this at a very safe point too, where before the sewing might have restricted it, that binding, because it had that cup nature because of the parchment, would have all created some problems in getting a high quality capture. So oftentimes we're matching up the conservation and the digital together so that we can get the best quality of both.
Mm-hmm. Great,
so I hope
thank
that
you
answers your questions, Nanette.
Yes, yeah, Todd, that's a great look at how you work with our other staff members as well to make those decisions. But obviously, your expertise is in the conservation effort of each object. And I did want to mention that, we are talking about digitizing our collections. Like Todd said, we're trying to do that more and more, especially for popular items for researchers. And we do have a great digital library and archives on our website. So I'll put that link in the comment section. It's really fun to search through there and see what we have, even if you're not able to visit the building. So a couple other questions for you, Todd. Wheaton asked, can you talk a bit about using gloves when holding old documents? She said in the UK, they're not required. Vellum apparently benefits from oils in our skin.
Well, I would say that definitely the best practice has changed on the use of gloves. So it used to be where people would say, oh, you should wear cotton gloves. But now for most materials, now there are some materials you would want to wear gloves with. Photographs would be a category of material. Metals would be a category of material, because even trace oils in your hands could damage both of those types of objects. But for most objects, books, documents, things like that, all you really need to do is wash your hands before using those objects. And in fact, what we find with gloves is that they inhibit your ability to feel the object when you're handling it. And that can actually cause more damage to the object than just using your hands, but just making sure they're washed. So always just wash your hands. And that's kind of best practice now, both in the US and the UK.
Great. Thank you, Todd. I know those best practices can also be helpful to folks at home if they have their own family history items and collections they're preserving. Okay, a couple other questions for you. You talked a little bit about some items that were completed or in progress of being conserved. Could you talk a little bit about how long certain projects might take you? Maybe easier for you to answer if you have a goal of how many things get conserved in a year, anything like that.
Well, the time can range quite a bit. So for the Gore roll, this parchment book that I showed you, that could easily be 30 or 40 hours of actually working on it, but that might be spread over several months. And then when you add in the imaging, which is going to take place during that, it can stretch, to 4 or 5 months even, because we want to make sure we get it right. And so we do testing and we do some other things. Some of the pamphlets that you see worked on, that might only be an hour or two, depending upon what it needs. So in general, on a yearly basis, we treat about 250 to 300 objects from the general collection. We treat about 16 objects from the JHC collection. We're trying to do 4 items from that collection each quarter. We treat maybe 20 to 30 items from special collections and a like number from our rare book collection. And then it really depends in the fine art collection, what kinds of exhibits we might put up in the building, what we want to focus on, what we feel needs attention. So that can range, the fine art can range quite a bit. And then also, the Conservation Lab, as I said, does digital prep for our digitization lab, and that can kind of be all over the place depending upon what they're working on and what kind of support that they need. But that gives you a kind of a ballpark of what we're doing in a year and how it can really change from item to item, how much time something takes.
Yeah, that makes sense based on, the scope of each individual project. But it's great to hear, some of those numbers in all the important work that you're doing each year for us, keeping our collections safe and preserved. Just a couple other questions for you. We talked a little bit about people out in the audience who might have their own family history papers or objects that they want to conserve and take care of. Do you have any advice or recommendations for conservation services that are maybe more widely available to the public?
Well, the number one thing I would say to someone who has private collections that they want to take care of is, protection. So boxing. Or putting, loose pieces of paper into folders and then putting those into a box. There's an old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So you definitely want to make sure that you have things protected first so that they're not going to get worse before you start to, think about extensive conservation treatment on any one object or two. There are generally some simple things that you can do yourself, with care. dry cleaning something with a soft brush and maybe a soft eraser, unfolding things that are folded up because they're stored better, flat. You can sometimes unroll things that are rolled tightly, using a humidification chamber, a simple, at-home humidification chamber. But I'd say the number one thing is, protecting things. And then once you have all of those things in place, you're protecting things, you have a good environment, then you might want to think about actually getting some conservation work done. There are conservators out there that can help you. There's a professional organization in America for conservators, AIC, which stands for the Association of Conservation. And so you can find usually conservator within a general area. There aren't that many conservators in the United States that you'd find one. Excuse me, it's the American Institute for Conservation. I've been talking too long today, AIC. So you might have to travel a little bit to try to find a conservator. Again, there just aren't as many, and there's so many objects that need conservation treatment.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, those are some great tips, and I will put the AIC link in the comment section too, just in case folks are interested in going that route right away. Maybe you're already caring for objects or papers as much as you can at home and want to look into that more. One last question for you, Todd, before we head out, and this might be a bit out of your scope of work as conservator, but how would you suggest someone find out more about donating some objects to us particularly?
Well, it's the curatorial staff handles the donations because they know the collections better. They know what our collection policy is, what areas we're looking to really beef up our collections in, and also what material we already have. So some of the specialists that we have, so the special collections librarians, the the curator in JHC, the fine art curator, it would be those collection specialists that really understand our collection the best and understand what fits within that scope of our collection.
Great. And I will put, I know our senior archivist, Judy Lucy, handles a lot of those donation conversations or requests. So I can put her contact information in that comment section too. I'm just loading in the links, contact info, everything in that comment section. So feel free to take advantage of those resources. Well, thank you again, Todd. This was a really special look on, what you do day in and day out to preserve our collections. And it's great to see, some of the really interesting and unique pieces that you get to work on, and really the scope of all different kinds of objects that we have in our collection. So big thank you to you. Before we sign off, I did want to promote just one event. The most relevant to the topic of preservation is our virtual preservation roadshow. So this special virtual event will teach you some of those best practices that we kind of just touched on today with Todd for surveying, handling, and storing your own family materials. And it will provide you with some expert advice on how to care for those items. In addition to gaining access to how-to videos, participants can also submit photos of an object to receive some advice from our experts, including Todd. And this event culminates with a live session with some of our experts at the end of January. So if you'd like to access information about that program or others, along with a lot more resources and content on our website, please visit our newly updated events calendar at americanancestors.org/events. So thank you again to Todd. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. I hope you have a great rest of your day and a really wonderful holiday season as well. I hope that we see you at another online program soon. Goodbye for now.
Thank you, Tricia.
Thanks, Todd.